Hello and welcome to the Royal United Services Institute here in the heart of London. We have done over the last few weeks a number of discussions about mapping the pandemic, about what the pandemic means for the world. We started by looking at Europe. We then continued by looking at some key countries in the world. And today we concentrate on the Middle East, where, of course, there have already been quite a severe number of cases of the infection. We will try to concentrate in the coming hour of what it means for the Middle East, this particular pandemic, what would be the medium and the long-term implications for that. We very much look forward to a discussion with you, the audience, wherever you are around the world. Please do use the questions and answers function on this app, on the Zoom app. Send me questions as the speakers contribute at any time, and I will try to fit you all in. We're joined by a very good panel of experts on the Middle East from the Institute. The first one to speak will be HA Hellyer, who's a senior associate fellow at the Institute. He will be followed by Dr. Aniseh Bassiri Tabrizi, who is a research fellow at RUSI. And then we will conclude, last but not least, with Dr. Ziya Meral, who is also a senior associate fellow at the Institute. I will start with Hisham to set the scene of how the Middle East looks under the pandemic at the moment. Hisham?
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Greetings to everybody around the World Wide Web. I hope you're all well and keeping safe. The Arab world is a very broad place, and the effects of COVID-19 are going to be very broad indeed. In a region with massive class differentials, huge gaps between the poor and the privileged, the impact of a pandemic such as this is going to be felt in very different ways. I can't hope to cover in full detail 22 states in 10 minutes, but some thoughts. We have the Gulf states where the health service is on average quite well developed. Those states are generally run autocratically, which means that quick decisions without much consideration for objections from political opposition or civil society are quite possible. In this situation, that could turn out to be an advantage for the citizenry and those above a certain level of economic standing. The situation is unlikely to progress past a certain point of danger in certain ways, and we'll get into the other ways later on. But in many of those states, in most of those states, there are working class migrant workers who live in often very crowded housing with often very poor conditions. At the moment, there doesn't seem to be a fear within these states of at least a current widespread contagion, but indeed of a possibility of that happening fairly soon. It's likely that the ruling elites are well aware that if the less privileged become widely infected, it will eventually spread to the rest of the population that is currently holed up in their houses. We see, for example, in Saudi Arabia that a number of medical professionals are concerned about the vast slums that are around Mecca and Medina, and that's where the biggest outbreaks in Saudi Arabia apparently have been. Those slums are home to hundreds of thousands of ethnically African or ethnically Southeast Asian Muslims whose parents or grandparents overstayed pilgrimage visas decades ago, as was reported. Those migrants exist within the kingdom without having proper legal status and very limited access to healthcare and other government services. And that will deter a number of them from actually seeking medical assistance because they will be worried about deportation. King Salman last week decreed that the government would provide treatment to any foreigner with the coronavirus, irrespective of their visa or residency status, but it's not clear that that's going to solve the issue. More generally, we should be keeping in mind that oil prices have already been in free fall. The two largest Arab economies are in the GCC and will be affected by this tremendously. The impact of the current pandemic is going to look rather different in the GCC as compared to elsewhere in the Arab world, and indeed elsewhere around the world, particularly because of this issue around migrant workers. These migrant workers, these displaced workers, they're foreigners, obviously, and they're unlikely to benefit from the cash supplements that GCC governments are going to want to provide their citizens at this particular time. And as such, these foreign workers, particularly those below a certain economic threshold, may well be finding themselves wanting to return to their countries of origin as a result of lack of support where they are at present. One needs to keep in mind, most GCC countries rely heavily on expatriate workers of various degrees of expertise, and the impact of their departures on these economies is likely to be rather dramatic. We can't underestimate what that's going to look like, considering that kind of demographic situation at present. The UAE, for example, is about 80%. 80% of its population is made up of expatriates. And considering that these countries are going to have to deal with the restrictions from COVID for months, we need to assume that repatriation is going to be substantial, and the impacts could be quite tremendous. And that has an outsized impact beyond the GCC, because it may result in support from the GCC to countries outside of it, towards countries that they back in the Arab world, for example, is going to diminish tremendously. For the near to medium term, I think the GCC is going to be looking inward, not outwards. Not part of the GCC, but on the Arabian Peninsula is the Yemen. I think we should all be very concerned about the Yemen. There was a fortunate olive branch that was declared in the last few days. The Saudis are announcing a cessation of hostilities. I'm not sure if that's actually going to hold. The Houthis have responded with their own negotiation platform. I'm not sure that the Saudis are going to actually adhere to those requests either. And the Yemen's health situation is quite abysmal at the quote-unquote best of times, i.e. outside of COVID. So COVID could really hit them very, very badly. And I think we all need to be aware of that. It's a humanitarian disaster already and could be much, much worse over the coming weeks and months. When we go further west and we look at the Fertile Crescent, the situation is more diverse. The Palestinian occupied territories are already suffering the impacts of a brutal occupation, which means their health sector is already very limited. We can't expect that the Israeli authorities, especially with their own problems domestically, are going to be much help in this regard. Occupation plus pandemic isn't particularly a great combination. In Syria, the authoritarianism of the Assad regime is now one out of many things we need to be concerned about, where refugees are trying to seek sanctuary in other parts of the country. We could well find ourselves seeing the COVID pandemic having utterly disastrous effects on an already incredibly vulnerable population. The largest Arab country, Egypt, has taken a number of quite appropriate measures, and it's clear that the strategy in this regard is being led by the civilians, not by the military. The health sector is not led by the military, nor by the security establishment. It's a very technocratic sector, with the health professionals taking responsibility and the lead, and they're empowered to do so. The authorities have recognized that this is a very serious situation. They're letting the health professionals take the lead accordingly, albeit with some choreographed measures that we've seen on various types of Egyptian media. The security sector is treating this like a national security issue, which is good on the one hand, because it means they're giving full support to the health sector, but it also means that anyone questioning the state can expect even less space to do so. In Egypt and across the region, one good thing going for them is that the average age is pretty low, far lower than European countries, so fewer people that are in the assumed risky categories in terms of age, not necessarily in terms of other health conditions. And the age factor partially explains what happened, regrettably, in Italy. But in all of these countries, there's a great importance to be placed on the need for coordination among state bodies. And where this doesn't happen, we could see a number of problems erupting. And in too many states in North Africa in particular, there are going to be a lot of traditional rivalries within different parts of the state apparatus, which they simply don't have the luxury for right now. A couple of last points before I hand over to my colleague Aniseh. I suspect we will see the increase of tensions in Libya, probably most significantly from Turkey, but my colleague Dr. Ziya Meral will speak on that. Ziya will speak, I think, extensively on Turkey, and why it's likely that it will be Turkey that ramps up activity as opposed to other external actors, because there's less of a human element that's involved there because of drones and so on, but I'll let Ziya talk about that. And finally, the point that I wanted to raise was about, and this is something that I found very interesting over the past few weeks, is about the religious establishment in all of these countries. Because as we know, the virus spreads when people congregate, and congregational activity, congregational prayer within the Arab world among Muslims, Christians, and others is very important for simply the cultural life of the place. Nearly all of those religious establishments, if not all of them, have actually been very clear about suspending congregational activities. This is going to be something very difficult in the region starting a couple of weeks from now, because Ramadan begins in just under 2 weeks. And Ramadan is when actually people congregate even more than usual, and where charitable contributions are expected from those who are less needy. That's not going to be possible in the same way anymore. Many of those charitable contributions go to providing for what are called mercy breakfasts, i.e. Meals at the time of the breaking of the fast, where people gather together and share their food. I'm not sure that's going to be possible. So with that, I will hand over back to Jonathan and presumably Aniseh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hisham. There's a number of questions. The questions are already coming in, and keep them coming throughout today. I should also say that we are live on YouTube, so you can follow us there if you find it easier. But on this channel, you should be able to actually ask us direct questions. Let me now turn to Aniseh, who I think will be talking about one of the countries in which developments have been most dramatic, namely Iran, early afflicted and very heavily afflicted. Aniseh, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thank you everyone for tuning in today with us for this discussion. Yes, I am indeed going to cover Iran and say a few words about how the country has reacted to the crisis and what the implication could be for the country in itself, but also for the region more broadly. I think it became clear very soon that Iran was going to be one of the countries worst affected by the pandemic, not just in the Middle East, but across the world. Today, we are talking about more than 60,000 people testing positive and around 4,000 people having died because of the virus. And obviously, these are just the official figures. We know that the numbers are likely to be much higher, especially because of the limited testing capability that Iran has. I think despite the crisis and the extent of it, many were surprised by the reaction of the decision makers in Tehran, especially at the beginning, because the tendency was to downplay it and instead portray an image of business as usual and everything is under control. In practice, this has meant that it took about a month between the first confirmed cases of COVID emerging in Rome in particular, and when the government actually decided to implement more forceful measures, such as, for instance, closing non-essential businesses, restricting travel between cities, and so on. I think there are mainly two reasons for this kind of business as usual policy. The main reason, which is also the most obvious one, is the state of the economy. Iran has been very concerned about the impact that a lockdown could have had on the already very fragile economy. We already have to keep in mind that in 2019, Iran saw a contraction of 9.5% of its economy, mainly as a result of US sanctions, but also because of generally the state of the economy prior to the imposition of sanctions as well. The mayor of Tehran has been very open about the fact that in a normal situation and in a state of good economy, Iran could have imposed a lockdown. But because of the state of the economy, it was unable to provide the necessary goods or even adequate compensation schemes that have been provided elsewhere. Even with the phased approach that Iran ultimately decided to use in terms of restrictive measures, the impact of the economy on the economy has already been very severe. We have seen a drastic collapse in the tourism, drop in revenues from goods and services, and drop in trade, even with the close economic partners such as China and Iraq. And this means that an economic contraction is likely to feature in 2020 as well. Some forecasts indicate that the unemployment rate could reach 40 to 50% as a result of COVID, as well as obviously continuation of sanctions and lastly, the prices of oil having dropped over the past few weeks. To mitigate some of the consequences of COVID, the government has managed to deliver some cash handouts and loans to low-income households and businesses. But I think the indication of the severity of the crisis in economic terms is the fact that Iran has requested, for the first time since the 1960s, an emergency loan of $5 billion from the IMF. I think the second reason, I think the less obvious one for Iran policy of business as usual and the maintenance of the image of everything is under control is the fact that Iran does not really want to give the impression of being weak, of being on the verge of collapse or of coming in under the maximum pressure campaign. So this is very much a message to the US that Iran is still having everything under control. Some within the Trump administration already indicate that want to capitalize on Iran's increased vulnerability and force Iran to the negotiating table. That has been already the case in the past few months, particularly after the demonstration that took place in Iran in November and January, but even more so after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the former head of the Quds forces. Within the Trump administration, there are many who have seemed to move away from an interest in engagement or a new deal with Iran, and instead are moving towards a double down of the maximum pressure campaign. So during the COVID crisis, this has meant that despite the calls of many, including the UK and the UN Secretary General, the US has not really showcased any interest to consider the lifting or the loosening of some of its sanctions against Iran to allow the country to access medicine and medical devices which are necessary to defeat the virus, particularly when it comes to protection gears and ventilators. In fact, over the past few weeks, we have seen additional sanctions being imposed by the US against entities and people who have been accused of fueling money to the IRGC and alimenting an already very, very high tension between Iran and the United States. I think even in the foreign policy and in the policy in the region, what Iran has been trying to do is maintain this business as usual image so far. And despite being preoccupied with the coronavirus outbreak, Iran is also made sure to continue defend and protect its national interests, national security interests abroad. I think the best example of that is Iraq, in which despite the pandemics over the past few weeks, we have seen the visit of the head of the Supreme National Security Council, Shamkhani, and the new commander of the Quds forces as well, Ghani, to Baghdad. I think the message that came after this visit and during this visit has been very clear and highlights how Iran wants to maintain its influence on the country when it comes to the selection of the next prime minister, when it comes to influence on the economic, religious, and political front, and broadly speaking, on the future of the country. I think the developments that we have seen today with the withdrawal of the nomination of Adnan Zurfi, someone who is perceived as very close to the US in favor of Mustafa Kadhimi as PM designate, is a perfect example of how Iran, during this pandemic, has managed to maintain pressure and exert its outcome through its influence and its back forces in Iraq, and therefore to have an outcome that is more favorable to its national security interests. The overarching goal for Iran in Iraq remains to push the US forces out of the country and to avenge the killing of Soleimani. And I think to achieve this goal, we have seen more and more activities from Iraq-backed militias, especially during March. We have seen a number of attacks to US interests in March, the main one taking place in Kaptaji. And we have seen 2 people from the US front and 1 British official have been killed because of this campaign. I think this all means that so far the crisis, the COVID crisis, has not really led to a reconsideration of Iran's interests and strategies in Iraq, but more broadly in the region. In fact, the pandemic might be considered as an opportunity to attack US forces with less risk of retaliation than before. And the US, in the same way, might consider COVID as representing an opportunity to try to destroy Iranian-backed militia groups in Iraq or to weaken the Iranian leaders because they are distracted with the crisis at home. And this means that really the risk of miscalculation and heightened tension is higher than before, not lower than before. If I may, just one final point on the nuclear issue, which, as we have seen prior to the COVID crisis, was really the only avenue remaining for some potential dialogue between Iran and the international community. I think this remains to be the case. As we have seen, Iran has not really reversed its decision to comply with the JCPOA and go back to full compliance. But at the same time, over the past few weeks, we haven't really seen any further steps that indicate an acceleration of its enrichment and reprocessing activities. What this means, I think, is that the nuclear issue for Iran remains the fight on which there is more flexibility and the desire to keep the door open for some sort of engagement and dialogue, especially when it comes to European parties, UK, France, and Germany. And this, at least for the time being. Obviously, there is much more to cover, but I think I will stop here, and I'm happy to expand on any of the points during the Q&A. Over to you, Jonathan.
Aniseh, thank you very much, and thank you for highlighting this sort of curious dichotomy between, on the one hand, the internal crisis in Iran and how Iran is coping to what is a catastrophic economic situation at the moment, but at the same time a determination to pursue Iranian strategic objectives in the Middle East in the way that the leadership wants it. Needless to say, plenty of questions coming in for you about that. But let us turn to my colleague Ziya Meral, who will be looking, I think, at the role played by Turkey and more generally at the broader northern part of the Middle Eastern region. Ziya?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan, and thanks to everybody who joined us for this discussion. I think Turkey pretty much went through all of the 7 stages of denial in this pandemic, just like any other country in the world. I think initially there was a sense that this was bypassing Turkey. It wasn't really impacting. The cases were in Asia and then increasingly in Iran and in Europe. But till pretty much March 11th, when was the first kind of diagnosis in Turkey, the attitude was pretty much, this is not impacting us. But I think at the official level, there were a lot of concerns. Since then, pretty much quickly, Turkey followed the similar kind of policies to any other government in Europe, shut down schools in pretty much 6 days after the first diagnosis. It limited the movement of elderly people older than 65, and interestingly, people younger than 18, still allowing some space for economic activity. It has shut down a lot of things, but also it has recently announced that it's investing into construction of 2 field new hospitals with 1,000 patient capacity. But as of this week, there is almost 40,000 people confirmed to have the virus, with some 1,500 of them at the ICU, and thus far a bit less than 700 people have died, which is still a bit relatively low, but Turkey still has one of the highest peaks of rate around the world in terms of the spread of the virus. And Turkey does have vulnerable populations for this. Diabetes, obesity, and smoking are really common and really high in the country, so I think that will cause complications, even though the population it favors the youthful side of the population rather than the elderly. But similarly, 4 million or so refugees who also have a lot of vulnerabilities, even though they do have access to health system. So I think it has been really interesting to observe how this impacted developments politically. Erdogan's popularity have increased according to a recent poll this week by up to some 55%, but obviously a lot of that can be explainable in similar contexts of crisis here in the UK and Europe, etc. So we don't necessarily know what that would mean in the long term, but the AKP and Erdogan also found themselves at odds with opposition held mayorships of Istanbul and Ankara, where they have taken domestic initiatives in those cities to help people, whereas the government wanted to be, the presidency wanted to be the one active in providing some of these things. And there's been, again, questions around freedom of expression, court cases brought against people on because of their tweets or social media sharings, criticizing some of the policies or some of the credibility of the official reports. And I think today the new announcement was that the Turkey requires social media companies to designate a Turkey person that can quickly answer their request to removal of some of the social media posts. But I think overall impact of this at the moment is really complex. One, at the foreign policy level or military operations level, Turkey, as of last Sunday, ordered its troops in Syria to contain their movement, because Syria at the moment has an unknown but suspected to be a very high rate of infection across the country. But at the same time, as Hisham already hinted on Libya, for example, it has escalated its operations last 2-3 weeks in the middle of this, particularly with the use of drones and striking some of the cargo ships and supply chains, etc. Interestingly, Turkey also responded to the call from Spain and Italy through the new NATO structures and provision of some of these PPE kits, as well as ventilators, and as it is also itself trying to recruit them domestically. But I think at the same time, its economic liabilities are quite clear. I mean, the 2018 lira crisis is still there, still lingers. Turkish economy has been shrinking, has been struggling to get funding for its very loose fiscal policy and mega projects, but also a lot of gaps and imbalances in its borrowal and expenditure and etc. And this crisis automatically brings a lot of economic questions, just like any other country. Thus far, the government has followed similar policies of providing unemployment benefits directly to the individuals, freezing the businesses, from stopping them from firing their employees and etc. And there's clearly a rush to enable fundings to ease the economic impact on the society. But in the long term, unlike other European countries, Turkish economy faces a lot of structural questions that would be very difficult to get funding to maintain this immediate response. There could also be opportunities for Turkey here, just like what Aniseh pointed out. Economically, if European countries all of a sudden turn around and have a different China policy, they want to contain trade with China, etc., it might very well open new opportunities for Turkey, maybe an upgrade on the customs union with Europe to enlarging it to include different sectors of trade between Turkey and Europe might actually come in as a very positive relationship for two. And the EU could very well use this moment to normalize some of the tensions with the country. But again, that's up to Ankara as well as to European capitals. But on the other hand, I think militarily, and the appetite of the government in Ankara to take risks, I think, will remain. I mean, today we have seen an announcement of a new Turkish drilling ship heading to Black Sea. Similar questions over Cyprus and energy resources in both East Med and the Black Sea. I think it's going to matter a lot more as a revenue for the state. And at the moment, I think Turkey might feel that it doesn't necessarily have the strong pressure or the attention that it has had 3 months ago, 4 months ago from Europe, and might find a lot of other new partners in bilateral relationships. So at the moment, I don't necessarily see massive shift in Turkish foreign policy either way. But I think a focus on economy, easing of some of the tensions, and trying to handle the political unrest that will play itself. And don't forget, for President Erdogan, his entire success has been based upon provision of services. Eudaimonic legitimacy mattered a lot to him as a mayor of Istanbul and prime minister and president. He lost the mayorships of Istanbul and Ankara, economy is crumbling, and now this pandemic. So he's going to face a lot more challenges domestically to maintain his popularity that he's at the moment enjoying. So I'll end there, and then we can discuss other aspects of this as the group.
Thank you very much, Ziya. So we have a very large number of questions, which is good. That's what I expected. And I think since we've got you, Ziya, I think the first question goes to you, and it is from Sir David Logan, a person known to you, a great expert on the region, who's asking, how does one interpret the Turkish troop movements in Syria? Does it indicate that Mr. Erdogan may be trying to limit his exposure, or he's likely to double down on his involvement there?
I think the virus is not necessarily going to be the defining impact on Turkish short and medium term presence and activities in Syria. Clearly, in the immediate context, they have ordered that, but the troops are still there. They have expanded the number of posts in the Idlib area. They're still very much involved in northeast Syria. And both of these conversations vis-a-vis what happens in northwest Syria, what happens in northeast Syria, are long-term questions that Turkey sees a direct security threat to itself too. So I don't necessarily see this phase as triggering a huge alteration of that, but it might very well create humanitarian questions for Turkey if it manages to contain its own virus and challenges. I think the need in Syria is going to be a lot larger than people speak about. I mean, you have millions of people who are displaced, and the aid that goes through UN structures to Assad regime and the aid that goes from Turkey and other partners to their own networks is not going to be enough. It might very well provide some sort of truce, some sort of structure to share aid between different parts of Syria, patronaged by other states, but I'm still skeptical as to whether every actor has the same humanitarian concern that we would have. I mean, I don't think Russia is necessarily shifting its policies and engagement, or Assad, and even though you see mosques and some movements contained, and everybody's entrenched positions are pretty much there. It might be a little pause. It might open some sort of pragmatic aid conversation, but I think for Turkey and other actors, their Syria policy is much more durable and long-term.
Thank you for that. The next question is sort of put by two people in sort of different ways. One is Lee Solomons, a civil servant, who's asking what is happening to the broader question of food imports. The region is very dependent, the entire region is very dependent on food imports, particularly the Gulf states. Are these things going to be assured? I think probably I rely on Hisham to answer that one. But slightly broader, put both by Mr. Solomons and by Captain Ezaru from the Romanian embassy here in London, who was asking, in broad terms, I know it's a bit of crystal ball gazing, and you may all want to come on this. Are we believing that this epidemic could be a catalyst for peaceful change, or could it just be increasing the known and existing fundamental cleavages and tensions in the Middle East? Hisham, would you like to start?
Thank you, Jonathan. And those are two very good questions. I'll tackle the second one first because it's quicker. So I don't think that we're going to see much in the way of positive change in the short to medium term arising out of this. I think it's more likely that we see probably not a massive increase in terms of those cleavages that do exist, as was mentioned. But there's a possibility of some minor increase. The big change issue that I wonder about really is in the GCC, because they're so reliant on expatriate presence within the GCC. and we could easily see a lot of people leaving as a result of the pandemic and going back to their countries of origin. And it will be difficult to replenish those numbers under these conditions with travel restrictions and so on. But that's unpredictable. I don't really know if we can gaze beyond that. When it comes to food shortages, as far as we can tell thus far, supply lines have remained relatively open. I'm not actually getting any reports of anywhere in the region having even runs on supermarkets. So the images that we've seen in the UK, for example, of supermarkets just being empty as a result of people going into panic buying. Generally speaking, I haven't really seen that within the region. I've been wondering if that would be the case, but so far supply lines seem to be fine. So that could change, obviously, because the knock-on effect of many of these things is quite intense. Jonathan, I also wanted to say something about Gaza, if I might, or would you like to continue with questions? Because I know there was a question about Gaza.
Yes, there was a question by Gaza from Robert Fox of the Evening Standard. You might as well take it on now, and then I'll pass on to Aniseh about the regional cleavages as well.
Okay, I'll make it very quick. So in terms of legal duties, Israel is the occupying power in Gaza. Gaza is still an occupied territory, and as the occupying power, they have the international legal duty to treat Palestinians on terms of the health sector as though they were their own citizens. I don't expect that to be the case, obviously. So at the moment, the response is being run by the authorities in Gaza, obviously Hamas, with support from UNRWA and the World Health Organization. There's some degree of quarantine. There's, of course, a problem about capacity under occupation and blockade. There are only 2,000 beds that are available. I've been told very helpfully by Kabu that there are 65 ventilators in use or in poor condition, and the Gaza Strip on its own needs at least 150. At the moment, it seems the containment strategy has worked. There were 13 cases, but no cases for a week. But there are very few, there are no more testing kits in the strip, so it's quite frankly impossible to know. And I should say the PA has responsibility in this regard as well, because they've tried to pile on pressure on Hamas with their own internal politics over quite some time. And part of that pressure buildup has been about the reduction of the amounts of medicines transferred to Gaza. So we should all be concerned, frankly, about the occupied territories in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you. Aniseh, I wonder if you could sort of address the question of, is this crisis going to actually deepen the divisions that already exist in the Middle East?
Thank you, Jonathan. Yes, I wanted to just adapt to what Hisham has said. I think there is a lot of expectation that this crisis might have repressed some of the grievances that emerged, especially in Iraq, Lebanon, and Iran, but also in the rest of the Middle East and North Africa, with the wave of demonstration that we have seen over the past few months. Obviously, because of the crisis, we have seen restriction in movement, and therefore we have seen no longer this demonstration taking place at the moment. But I think what I would say is that we cannot really expect the grievances to disappear. In fact, because of the severe impact on the economy of so many of these countries, but also of the tendency of some of these countries to use the crisis as a tool to increase repression or to discriminate against minorities or others that have been marginalized, we are likely to see a rising of these grievances once the crisis has been defeated all over.
Thank you for that. Hisham, can I just return to you on the subject of, is it going to get worse or is it going to get better? I know it's a bit of an unfair question, but for instance, we have difficulties, internal difficulties in quite a number of these countries. And if the health services are going to be subjected to a lot of pressure, places like the Gulf, places like Jordan, for instance, or Egypt. How are they going to cope with it? I have a question the specific question from Georgina Sinclair, who's asking precisely about how Jordan is going to cope with these situations. But in general, in terms of the internal cohesion of these countries, can they make it?
So as you say, it's a bit difficult for us to predict. Jordan, incidentally, went into a complete shutdown and lockdown pretty early on. And I think that that's been a successful way for them to contain. The problem with the strategy of containment is that at some point, you're going to need to open up in order for people to go to work and people to make money for their families and to eat and so on. I mean, one of the biggest problems in a country like Egypt, where poverty is quite a massive issue, is that people simply can't afford to stay at home because they live on monies that they make from day to day, and the state hasn't been able to provide them with funds in order to make up for that. And many of these people are in the informal employment sector. So it becomes very difficult to fill in that gap because many people aren't registered. Now, having said that, the Ministry of Social Solidarity in a country like Egypt has made it clear that even if you are in the informal sector, you'll get something. But I'm not sure that's going to be sufficient. So it's very difficult. There's a bit of a range in terms of what the health service looks like in these different countries. The number of beds, for example, in Egypt as compared to the UK and the NHS, it's actually much larger, proportionally speaking, in Egypt. Of course, the type of care and the quality of care will differ tremendously, but in terms of numbers, it's actually better in Egypt than it is in the UK. But we simply don't know how they're going to be able to cope. And I think that this is why the state has taken this on as a national security issue, because even though the numbers aren't huge, yesterday in Egypt, I believe the number of deaths from COVID was recorded as 9. 9 is the highest number since the beginning of the pandemic, and it's been steadily increasing. You know, a few weeks ago it was like 1, 2, 3, and then it went up to 5, 6, 6, 6, and then it went up to 8 a few days ago, dropped a bit, and then went to 9. So we can see that there is an increase. We haven't reached the peak, and it's not decreasing yet. So if it becomes overrun, then I'm afraid we're in the same situation in a country like Egypt or in Jordan as we are pretty much everywhere else in the world. Italy couldn't cope, and we saw what happened. And I'm very saddened by the Italian situation. One, I hate to say silver lining of the Italian situation is that other countries can see what will happen if you don't take massive measures right now in order to avoid doctors being put into that kind of situation. Again, I really hesitate I don't like calling it a silver lining because there's really no silver lining in that regard when it comes to Italy. And I do hope they recoup very soon.
Thank you for that. Aniseh, I wonder if I could ask you, one of the real interesting developments in this entire humanitarian tragedy has been the fact that this provided the first transaction for the so-called special arrangement that the European states have made to try to ensure that humanitarian goods continue to go to Iran, and notwithstanding the US position on sanctions. So we had the first transaction. What do you make of it? Is it just a symbolic gesture, or is it the beginning of something different in terms of the sanctions regime?
Well, I think it was definitely a welcome development. We have to remember that this has been in the cards for more than 1 year. France, Germany, and the UK have been trying to make that happen for more than 1 year. However, I think both the scale but also the type of the transaction indicate that this is still a very limited tool when it comes to alleviating the humanitarian concern that Iran has manifested when it comes to the impact of sanctions, but even more after the COVID crisis has emerged. The transaction was just of 500,000 euros, and it was about medical devices and not of medical devices directly related to COVID crisis, because again, like this mechanism was intended to alleviate some of the issues and unintended consequences of sanctions. before the crisis emerged. I think, generally speaking, despite the anticipation, this mechanism will be remaining a limited tool at the disposal of the European countries. Certainly a welcome one, another one that it's coupling the Swiss humanitarian channel, but definitely when it comes to tackling the crisis at the moment, it's not something that it's going to address the immediate concern of the Iranians when it comes to having the right tools at their disposal to fighting the virus. And it's not going to be a sufficient tool when it comes also to alleviating, generally speaking, the impact of US sanctions on Iran. Because again, this is a tool just for humanitarian goods, foods, medicines, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to other goods, the mechanism cannot be used.
Thank you very much for that. I should say that this question came from Angela Di Maria. Let me just turn to a question from Tobias Schreier to you as well, Aniseh, which is, which of the sanctions, current sanctions, are actually having the worst effect on Iran when it comes to the question of managing the health crisis?
So the problem with the sanction is that, in theory, the US sanctions against Iran, they have a humanitarian exemptions. But the problem is that despite that, banking institutions and companies still remain very, very wary about engaging with Iran because of the concern about having basically a violation, an unintended violation of the US sanction, and therefore being subject to penalties, which has been the case in the past. So even before the crisis emerged, there has been a lot of discussion about how to tackle the unintended consequences of sanctions. But I think what is important right now is that there has been a very significant call, which was not present before, by parties, not just the usual suspect, but we are talking the Secretary General, the UN Secretary General, we are talking the UK, we are talking even members within Congress, about the fact that, in fact, the sanctions that have been imposed do not help Iran in tackling COVID, and there should be some leeway from the US in being flexible and find ways to either offer a letter of comfort or further clarification for companies and banking institutions to know what exactly they can export to Tehran without facing the potential consequences of sanctions.
Thank you for that. A question for Hisham, I think, from Mike Gapes, a long-standing member of parliament here in the UK, which is, what will happen to migrant workers in the GCC? You mentioned the fact that there were some questions about undocumented workers and whether they could benefit from any health services, that the Saudi Arabia has tried to address them. But in general terms, I mean, in terms of the disease itself, in terms of the potential implications, where do you think we stand on the migrant workers in the GCC?
So thank you. That's a good question. And yes, I'm familiar with Mike. So the issue is that here you have, in different parts of the GCC, I think the different elites recognize that the virus will not stay with one population. It spreads, right? So they can't hope to cordon it off. On the other hand, in order to keep the economies afloat, they're going to have to give a lot in terms of cash handouts. And I don't think that they can afford to do that from within their own perspective. They can't afford to do that with migrant workers, particularly migrant workers that are not occupying very senior levels within, you know, whether the bureaucracy of the GCC or important companies and so on. Now, it'd be very difficult for them to leave and to fly back because of restrictions on travel. I think the restrictions on travel are going to intermittently change, right? So, for example, there are a number of countries within the Arab world right now where you see limited flights going back, for example, to the UK. in order for people who are from the UK in the region to come back to the UK. They're not regular, but they are intermittent, and I think that that will continue, and I suspect that we may see that with regards to some of these countries of origin for migrant workers. I would like to think that there might be a positive outcome out of this, and that popular support on the ground in GCC countries for migrant communities and how those migrant communities have supported these countries is going to change as a result. I'm not really confident about that. I think on the contrary, people are going to hunker down, and they're going to be more inward-looking rather than less, alas. So at the moment, as I said, it's being contained, but particularly given the state of housing for many of these laborers in the GCC, it could be very, very difficult indeed to control a spread in those types of communities.
Thank you for that. I think I've got a question now, which perhaps Ziya, knowing your interests, may wish to address. It's from Gillian Dare, who works for the Foundation for Relief and Reconciliation in the Middle East. And she's asking, what is the condition of ethnic and religious minorities in the region? Many of them apparently being accused now of being allegedly responsible for the spread of the virus. One always looks for scapegoats in such situations, and she fears, as she put it in her question, that there already are indications of ethnic and religious minorities being fingered as the alleged culprits. I wonder if you could say something, or perhaps Hisham afterwards as well, if you are aware of any such developments.
Yeah, I mean, I think her question is more of a very important point to raise, which is the exact point that you made. We know that pattern in the Middle East. We know that pattern in Europe. Whenever there is a crisis, the religious minority, whether it is the Jews or the Baha'is or the Christians or the converts or Zoroastrians and etc., somebody often gets the blame, or LGBTQI community members. And I think that at the moment, I'm not necessarily seeing a massive focus on it across the region. I think in different localities, you've seen reactions towards Chinese workers, people who traveled and etc., and class tensions. But I think the ultimate question in everybody's mind has been thus far their own personal security, what their states are doing. At the moment, I'm still very cautious with a lot of our inferences about the future, because this thing has been changing every week. I think to me, a lot of the questions boils down to how long are we going to go through this phase, and how long this will stretch, and what kind of social political impact this will have. But her point is very well taken as a serious concern that we have seen before.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I've got a more direct question on Oman from Rowley Sword here in London, who is asking the sort of one oasis of quiet in the region. It had its own leadership change, low oil prices, troubles all around. What prospects for Oman?
So I wish that I had more recent information on how COVID was actually affecting Oman. At present, I don't. So I shan't try to wing that. But as far as I know, the last time that I checked, Oman wasn't being heavily affected by this, and one hopes that they're going to escape too much of an impact, not only on their economy but their population. I should say that Oman has a much, let's say, broader history of integrating migrants into their society in a very real way. So you have that, historically speaking, in Oman as compared to other GCC states. So the situation in Oman with regards to impact on the labor force is probably going to be quite different.
Ziya, I wonder if I could ask you a question about Turkey's broader security concerns or activities. You said that the virus epidemic itself is unlikely to affect their power projection in Syria on its own. What about elsewhere, like the Horn of Africa?
Similar. I mean, Turkish base in Somalia is one of the biggest deployments of any foreign troops in the country, and it's a huge territory. I think mobility is a question for all of the militaries at the moment, and operational security. Even in Turkish military bases, we have seen measurements to keep soldiers apart from each other by 2 meters or more, limiting the numbers of people who stay in the same room. A lot of militaries are adopting into these type of preventions, but I think, again, it really boils down to how long this will continue, what infection rate would be, fatalities, and how the health system would respond to this. So at the moment, I think what we see is pretty much what we see, which is desire to limit the movement of troops, desire to spread the grouping of the troops together, but not necessarily a policy change. And I think that policy change and long-term presence is really only going to be a calculation based on economic conditions, the domestic political pressure on the government, whether or not actually this main challenge will be domestic from now on. And I think between these two kind of dynamics, we're going to see an alteration or a modification of Turkish policies. But again, Horn of Africa, Syria, Libya, for example, last 2-3 weeks has seen an intensified Turkish drone strike rate and very high risk operations. But again, those are drones, they're remotely handled. So Turkey actually has the capability to be able to do the same in Syria if it feels threatened or needs to protect its soldiers. But I can't imagine Turkey launching a new operation in Syria and extending further into the territory at this stage. But again, a lot of these are weekly kind of conversations rather than a few months long forecast.
We are rapidly reaching the end, so I'll have one question that probably is on the mind of many of our listeners, which is that this kind of epidemic, is it likely to be a boon for terrorist organization like the so-called Islamic State, which at least in messaging terms started by being fairly quiet about it and is now at least putting out some notices purportedly suggesting that they are now considering the weakness of the West as an opportunity to strike. Any ideas, Hisham? Would you like to start?
Sure. So I think that we need to be very careful about the narratives that they're putting out, because this organization thrives on disinformation and throwing out these narratives, trying to make it seem as though they have more strategies than they have and more an impact than they have. So I personally don't see any growth in the organization as a result of this. On the contrary, frankly, it could turn out to be a reason for the organization to decrease in importance. But we shall see. It's at the moment the narratives have been very interesting, and that they at one point they were talking about how this was a punishment on different populations for having done X or Y, etc. But these are all just these are all PR strategies, and I'm not sure that we can read anything into any of this. Now we should be all very aware that of course there are vulnerabilities that are showing up all around the world as a result of COVID, and I do think people have to be aware of that. Not simply, I should say, from groups like ISIS, but also far-right supremacist groups in terms of what they're also promoting in different ways. And you see that in the United States, you see that elsewhere as well. So I think we all have to be very aware that at least on some level, this is a vulnerability that many would like to take advantage of. Thank you, Jonathan.
Aniseh, would you like to add something to this?
Yeah, just quickly that I would keep a very focused attention on what's happening, especially in Iraq, because of COVID, with the movement of the US-led counter-Daesh coalition and the withdrawal of some of them because of the COVID crisis. Some discussion about reconsidering Operation Inherent Resolve. I think if in the immediate that is not necessarily going to strengthen or boost recruitment or resources for Daesh, it could still provide an opportunity to to fill a vacuum, and therefore what happens in Iraq, especially by ISF and how the Iraqi forces will try to maintain the control of the territory, given the recent developments and movement of troops, will be crucial.
Thank you very much for that, Aniseh. And I think one question to all the panelists, and I'm afraid it will have to be the last one, put by a variety of people, including Madeleine Moon, the long-serving MP here in London, and a number of others, asking whether all the technology that is now being used to isolate people, identify infected people, the apps that Israel has pioneered in using on its own population to identify focal points of the disease, whether this entire apparatus of new technology and some old technology is likely to actually strengthen repression in the Middle East, strengthen the powers of states to control their people electronically. Ziya, why don't we start with you?
Look, even Turkey today launched a similar app to Israel that will keep an eye on individuals who have already been tested and confirmed as COVID-19 cases, and they'll be able to see whether you left your house and notify you if you do. So at the skeptical level, those technologies were already there, right? So the reason why those apps can quickly pop up, mobile phone data can quickly be garnered and harnessed and used this way, is that all of the states in the region already have extremely effective and highly technological ways of monitoring data, mobile connectivity, and etc. So that's why Turkey was able to, develop quickly technology of sending text messages to people who got tested and etc. So what I think the biggest impact will be is whether the populations would see these very public expressions of surveillance technology as positive, therefore normalize it, therefore have a more positive approach to it, and what data would they be themselves personally willing to give and share, and therefore actually normalize this process. And that will create new legal questions on the international law, but domestic law, but I think it will create new dynamics between societies, their security services, and it always has a dark side. If the state can achieve more access to your data and you're willing to share that and you normalize it, then inevitably, obviously, these will have political ramifications when the state is not too happy about what a particular individual or group is up to.
Aniseh?
Yes, I think as in other answer that I gave, my sense is really what we are going to see is the strengthening of existing trends. So in the countries in which repression seemed to be the direction, the use of technology seemed to be the way to increase that repression, I think COVID could be used as a pretext to further strengthen their hand and control over the society. And even further intensify the legitimacy crisis that we have seen in some of the countries that we have discussed today. But I wouldn't say that that is a general trend. I think it really is something that we should watch for in the countries that we're already going in that direction, rather than a general trend in all countries in the region.
Hisham?
Thank you, Jonathan. Just very quickly, I would agree with what my co-panelists have said, particularly Ziya, in terms of these technologies were already there. I think these different countries want surveillance to increase anyway. I think that what they've got is a bit of a boon at the moment, in that they can increase surveillance without much in the way of opposition. But frankly, opposition wasn't going to really matter all that much anyhow. I mean, that's simply not how these states function. More importantly for me, frankly, is how these states are going to look at the health sector in a different way going forward. At the moment, these are generally technocratic. These are generally quite professionally run, and they're not regarded as part of the security apparatus in any of these countries. That could very well change as a result of this pandemic. And finally, on repression, I think it will be, as Aniseh pointed out, a strengthening of very existing trends, but I don't think much more of one. So in that regard, the long term doesn't look all that different, in my opinion.
Thank you for that. As we said at the beginning, it was unlikely that we will be able to cover every aspect. And I apologize to those of our listeners who were not able to have their questions answered today. But we will return to the subject, and we will return to mapping the epidemic as it goes on every Thursday here from London. So from the heart of London, from the Royal United Services Institute, thank you to Hisham, thank you to Aniseh, and thank you to Ziya for their presentation. And above all, thank you all for the audience for listening to us.